Welcome to the English Language Digest of the Kaleidoscope podcast, your source for inspiration. Just like a kaleidoscope, which creates ever-new changing forms and mirroring patterns, in the Kaleidoscope podcast, different viewpoints and perspectives, different thinkers and experts are brought together in new ways. In the English Digest, we pick up on some of the ideas and reflect on them for our non-Yemeni listeners. Our aim is to inspire you to think beyond boundaries, to look at issues from new angles, and to integrate new ideas into inspiring, innovative solutions. Don't forget that you're part of this kaleidoscope, and sharing your thought is important to us. Contact us after each episode on social media or at contact@yemenpolicy.org.
In a survey conducted in 2019 by the Yemen Polling Center on security perceptions and police work in Yemen, funded by the European Union, nearly half of Yemenis indicated that the police should be the actor to have authority over security provision in their area. This is true both for Yemenis living under the Houthi de facto authority as well as Yemenis from other territories, where of course it is predominantly the internationally recognized government, the Southern Transitional Council, and the Islah Party that are in control of the security sector. Amidst this state fragmentation, it is currently not the case that the police is the one authority charged with security, however, and this is not necessarily new. There has been always a plethora of actors involved in the formal and informal security sector, including military, paramilitary, intelligence, but also sheikhs or community figures. Throughout YPC's research on the security sector, we have learned that security institutions in many ways have become weaker in the course of the conflict. But in other ways, they have also become stronger. So this is what we want to talk about today. I'm Mareike Transfeld, the co-founder and director of the Yemen Policy Center, and I'm here today with Mohamed al-Iriani, one of our research fellows, to discuss these questions. In the previous episode of this podcast, Mohamed spoke with Kamal Muqbil, the research director of the Yemen Polling Center in Taiz, and Rasha Abdulkafi, the former commander of the women's battalion in the 35th Armored Brigade. So Mohamed, the police appear quite popular. Is that so? I mean, what does policing actually look like for the police to be that popular? How do people experience policing in their everyday lives? And how do local level police stations even manage to operate given the fragmentation of this state?
Well, yes. In many ways, the police are very present and in some ways popular. If we look back at the survey you referenced, we also learned that about half of Yemenis say the police are the first security actor to respond in case of trouble. And it's possible that if we were to repeat that same survey today, this number could be even higher, which is definitely a positive trend. As for the question of what the police actually do, the institution provides the community with basic security. Its primary function is to keep the peace. Sometimes they also provide mediation services for civil disputes such as unpaid rent. And at other times, and this is usually the priority, they enforce criminal law through the collection of evidence, writing of reports, arresting criminals. This would be for cases such as assault and theft. In regards to preventing and solving such crimes, the police have been quite successful. But there are many types of cases where the police itself is powerless and can't really intervene. Cases like disputes over land, infractions of the military or other armed groups fall into this category. And this is because compared to these other actors, whether we're talking about military, militias, heavily armed tribes, or civilians, the police, by comparison, is relatively powerless. They often don't have the type of resources necessary to intervene in cases that such actors would get involved in. And to be frank, the situation has become worse recently, as there's really a type of competition amongst arms groups and other elements within the security sector to be the main authority within security provision. this time, the police just don't have the position to challenge these other armed groups. So connected with this, the police are only popular when compared to the military and other armed groups. We can also look at what Kamal had to say on the topic. He had an interesting answer for the question of police popularity.
التطلع للشرطة هو أصلاً جزء من تطلع الناس وتعلقهم بالدولة عموماً في ظل الانقسامات الحالية.
The popularity of the police in the surveys expresses the community's desire to have a functioning state. In light of the fragmentation that is taking place, the presence of uncontrolled groups, and the proliferation of weapons, people believe that the police is the best option, especially in cities where individuals find themselves unprotected and confronted by armed groups. In rural areas, people may be protected by tribes. These survey results may not reflect what actually exists momentarily as much as it is a reflection of what people hope and aspire to.
Adding to this, the police are, of course, widely perceived as corrupt, and they're also seen as being part of this very politicized and problematic security sector, a sector which has lost much trust within the community. This was underlined by Rasha in our last podcast.
في الحقيقة فقدوا اليمنيين الثقة بقطاع الأمن.
In fact, Yemenis have lost confidence in the police, and I mean here in places controlled by the internationally recognized government. Policemen are often the ones who commit crimes, but they are at the same time the ones who appear to be solving them. The politicization of the security apparatus has raised concerns regarding the security sector as a whole. The apparatus moves according to the whims of the military leaders who belong to the dominant political party. Before the war, there was a state presence, even if it was weak. The security apparatus in general was rather neutral and closer to the communities. Despite its leaders having political loyalties pre-war, these loyalties remained taboo and had to be kept secret. In contrast, they dominate the whole sector now.
A major difference with regards to the politicization before 2011 and now is that before the popular protests, there was only really one dominant political party within the security sector, and that was the General People's Congress of the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. In general, other political orientations were kept aside, especially in the security sector, which was only meant to serve the regime. I mean, we all know that the various branches of the security sector were led by members of the Saleh family. And today we have this fragmentation of the state and the fragmentation of political power. In general, political loyalties are out in the open, with different parts of the security sector being controlled by different political parties or groups. And to top it off, there's competition amongst these groups. Frankly, this competition is part of the problem when it comes to police performance. Of course, the police sector has undergone dramatic changes in the course of the conflict, and the way it operates is markedly different.
All of this is really fascinating. So for people outside of Yemen, especially Westerners, it appears to be really difficult to grasp what these security institutions are like. I mean, how they are functioning. Often Westerners appear to apply a very Weberian understanding of state institutions, which obviously cannot be applied here. At the same time, the popular imaginations of what a failed state is do also not apply here. We're not in a situation of absolute chaos and lawlessness. No, there are institutions that are operating. Police officers in uniform are going to work and are dealing with cases brought to them by members of the community. Mohamed, could you explain a bit how these institutions manage to function and what the context is like?
Yeah, sure. In areas of southwest Yemen that witness direct confrontations between the Houthis and local resistance groups, or the army under the internationally recognized government, the police sector temporarily collapsed. Police officers left their stations, some to escape the fighting, others joined resistance groups, and some even joined the Houthis. What's important to understand is that in many of these locations, especially higher-ranking officials were part of the network of the former President Saleh, which put them at odds with local resistance movements that had sought to defend their cities against the Houthi incursion. An example of this would be the chief of police in Aden at the time, Abdulhafiz Saqaf. Later, he served under the Houthis in Ib. At that time, many police stations were destroyed and nearly all of them were looted. For instance, in Taiz, the building of the security department, which is the highest police authority in the governorate, was occupied by militias. But this really hit district-level police hard as they already had little resources to begin with. Once the internationally recognized government regained control over these areas, they began to rebuild the sector. But the focus was mainly on the government-level security department. Nominally, it would then be the responsibility of the security department to rebuild the district-level police, but this only occurred on a rudimentary level, and in the end, the government-level budget was low, and it was often withheld from district-level police, and still is till today.
So, if there are no operational budgets, how is it that policemen on the district level continue to go to work? And how is it that police continue to operate?
Before talking about how the police manage to operate, I wanted to highlight some of the challenges police are dealing with. First, and as we mentioned earlier, salaries were not paid regularly, and the operational budgets approved by the Ministry of Interior were far from sufficient. Currently, police personnel haven't received their salaries in more than 9 months. So how could a policeman perform his job in the light of this situation? To add, the small operational budgets are delivered at intervals, for example, every 3 months. This leads to a lack of logistical equipment and overall difficulties for the stations to provide the services they're mandated to provide. This means that many police stations at the district level don't have cars, they don't have phones, and many lack basic office furniture. I mean, the very rudimentary equipment needed to operate any kind of office is often absent. And from research we conducted together with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, we learned that police stations mostly lack equipment and the knowledge to keep logs and archives of their activities. Yemen polling researchers also visited the police stations for themselves and saw the desolate state some of these stations are in, with some of them being located in partially destroyed buildings and others simply not having enough space to accommodate the police staff working at the station. On top of that, a very small percentage of the police are armed, especially in the areas under the internationally recognized government. So the question poses itself: how can police carry out their duties in the face of informal armed groups, in the face of weapon proliferation within communities? Honestly, it's a paradox. The state that usually has a monopoly on the use of legitimate force is not adequately armed, while informal armed groups have an abundance of weapons. I mean, some police stations have more than 30 officers, with no more than 3 or 4 of them being armed. So in our present research, which is funded by the German Federal Foreign Office, we were guided by exactly that question. What keeps police officers going, and why do the police still operate? I mean, on a very basic level, the police appear to believe in their mission statement, regardless of government. Police officers believe that it's their duty to work for the community and to keep it safe. This is surely a motivational factor, but of course, the uniform and position also give police officers some legitimacy and puts them in a position to gather resources necessary to operate the police station. Buildings, water, electricity, for example, are often provided by businessmen. And we also found that some police stations are operating from abandoned hotels without having to pay rent. If it weren't for the role played by the community, the police wouldn't be operating to the degree it's at today. The local community, and this includes both civilians and the private sector, have contributed in many ways to support the sector. For example, the private sector for electricity provided electricity services to police stations without any financial compensation. There are also those who provided temporary buildings in place of the stations that were completely destroyed during the war. And in terms of civilians, many of them lent their cars and in some cases paid sums of money to cover costs of transportation and daily expenses of policemen who took charge of their case. And despite the danger that exists from these relations, the directors of police stations emphasize that assistance by people is voluntary. But as already pointed out by Kamal, this of course holds many risks. Here's what Kamal had to say, for instance.
لا طبعا لا يمكن التعويل على دور المجتمع أو على استمرار دور المجتمع في مساعدة الشرطة.
Of course, it is not possible to rely on the role of society in helping the police to overcome the challenges that we have mentioned, especially with regards to services and material matters. It is true that the current efforts may reflect society's yearning for the presence of a strong and effective police sector, but I do not expect the situation to continue. And it would not be good if it did continue. The police should not become hostage in the hands of those who provide them with aid.
The police sector is pretty much selling itself to the highest bidders, and most of the time, those with political loyalties will have the most financial resources, as pointed out by Rasha.
التحديات السياسية والاقتصادية بشكل عام شكلت عائق كبير في طريق عمل الأمن.
The political and economic challenges constituted a major obstacle in the way of security and police work in the liberated areas, through direct intervention by political party leaders in their work and through appointments of their leaders. Moreover, any leader affiliated with a particular party has greater financial support for him and his station. This, in addition to the interruption of salaries, has exacerbated the challenges by limiting police personnel, impeding their ability to work or even commute to crime scenes, especially with the lack of security vehicles in some police stations.
This support from the community for the police, of course, also attests to the fact that the community wants a strong police to be present. We've discussed that earlier. But the risks associated with this are clear. What do you think would need to be done to ensure more independent sources of funding?
Well, it doesn't look like we can expect proper operational budgets to be coming from the top down, given the current economic crisis and the situation of the government in general. So what really needs to happen is a systematic and transparent tax collection by local authorities. I mean, we're already seeing that all sorts of local institutions are collecting fees for services that used to be free of charge or are raising their prices. The community understands this as a form of corruption and people making illicit profits. But at the same time, we already have actors in the security sector imposing all sorts of taxes on markets, transportation of goods. These taxes are usually collected at checkpoints. But because of these potential revenue sources, we see that different branches of the security sector are competing against each other and infringing on each other's work, such as the military and police. The police, of course, are the weakest link. This tax collection needs to be done in a systematic and transparent manner. But again, the question is how unarmed authorities can impose this on armed actors. This again may be related to the loyalties within institutions.
I would imagine that a police funded through taxes in this way could also feel much more accountable to the community. Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. There is, of course, so much more to say, but we are at the end of the podcast. Of course, Mohamed, you have a paper coming out about this soon. I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you so much for this conversation. And thanks again for bringing in Kamal and Rasha on this very important topic. Thank you for the listeners and tune in for our next episode. Thank you and goodbye.